I'm going to go back further than that to early imperial China, Alex, because that was the place where they first began philosophically meditating upon the fundamental divide in politics, which is between, on the one hand, the totalitarians, as we would call them now, they called them in those days the legalists, and on the other, the libertarians, that's what we would call them now, and they called them the Confucians. And so the debate between the legalists and the Confucians has gone on really throughout the history of global government, going all the way back to imperial China, where we're going back thousands of years. And that is and will always be the fundamental divide between those who wish to control everything from the center and those who, like you and me, Alex, reckon that we can trust the people to decide for themselves how their government should be shaped and how it should run. And that's why we support the US Constitution. And we don't support the attempts to undermine it and circumvent it by your current president and his cabinet. And on the question of the climate, which is just the latest manifestation of the totalitarian or legalist faction, they have decided to do something which, as far as I can tell, looking back through history, is unique. They've decided, and I think it's a strategic mistake on the part of the totalitarian left, they've decided to try to politicize science itself. They've decided to adopt a particular scientific viewpoint as party policy, as the party line. Now, this is very strange. Of course, there have been precedents for scientific madnesses being adopted by individual nations, such as Lysenkoism under Stalin, where Lysenko, who was a country agronomist, was elevated to be ludicrously head of the Soviet Academy of Sciences and managed to kill 20 million Soviet citizens over a 20-year period with a succession of failed harvests because of his mad theory that soaking the seeds of the corn in water over the winter rather than planting them to get used to the temperature would give you a better crop, or it gave you failed crop after failed crop. And that was adopted for a time by the Soviets, and of course eventually they realized it was mad and they stopped doing it. Likewise, there was Hitler. You go back to Hitler's Germany, where the first use of centralized, full-scale lying propaganda, soon to be copied by the Soviets and now by the totalitarian left worldwide, was to be introduced. And there, the scientific dopiness that they took on board was eugenicism. Now, both of these have now been proven to be nonsensical. But what's now happened is you've got a global totalitarian governing class realizing for the first time that via international institutions such as the UN and the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and the World Bank and the all these different centralized organizations, not one of which is elected, they can draw all this together and centralize their power. But they needed a scare story in order to frighten us.
And let's go back, though, just because I threw out the French Revolution, that was really the opposite of what the American Revolution was, in my view. Just because I'm interested in it, what's your take on my statements about the fact that you trace communism back to the French Revolution and this attempt?
Well, it goes back much further than that. It is a very, very old and very, very tired.
No, I know it even goes back to Plato. Yeah, I mean, Plato even talked about, some of these ideas and debated them back and forth. I understand that, but specifically, what is your take on the French Revolution?
I mean, of course, that, too, is a very fine demonstration of this notion of putting the collective before the individual. And, of course, they didn't believe for a moment in liberty or equality or fraternity. They believed in replacing one governing class, which was relatively competent, with another that wasn't, and which soon collapsed in favor of a sort of brief and flashy attempt at empire, whereupon the whole of Europe ganged up against this nonsense and brought Napoleon down. So it was a pretty dramatic failure, the French Revolution, but they're still terribly proud of it. They ought to be ashamed of it.
And that's why I brought it up, because it failed, and every major tyranny ends up failing. The question is, with all the new high-tech ingredients and more fancy propaganda at the technocrats' hands, what does your gut historically tell you, Lord Monckton, who I know is a scholar and also a journalist? What is your gut? How does your gut tell you this is going to end? How do you see it playing out?
The new dimension here is the fact that this has gone global. The globalization of totalitarian groupthink is an immensely serious problem, because those who love freedom are by instinct independent-minded. You know this from the people you interview. We all think in our own way, we talk in our own way, we don't follow the party line of any party, really. And this gives the left, the legalists, the totalitarians, a permanent political advantage, and an advantage which actively becomes dangerous when government starts to become global. So if we go back only as far as the Jacobins and the French Revolution, and you come forward from there, you see the gradual global dissemination of the idea that we should salute and obey our masters in the governing class. A thing which the aristocrats in Britain never expected or demanded is now expected and demanded by the totalitarian left, and with increasing arrogance. For instance, Professor Lennart Bengtsson, one of the most eminent scientists in the world, a physicist, and he was the head of the Max Planck Institute in Germany, which is Europe's foremost scientific institution. And not so long ago, having safely retired, because he couldn't have dared to do this before he retired in the new and intolerant and unacademically free scientific world, he decided to join the policy of my good friend Nigel Lawson's Global Warming Policy Foundation, which is a think tank in the United Kingdom, the only one devoted to giving people the other side of the story, first on the economics and now also increasingly on the science. And of course, it was an enormous coup for the Global Warming Policy Foundation to have persuaded somebody as eminent as Professor Bengtsson to join the academic advisory board of the Global Warming Policy Foundation. So he joined it, but within 10 days, he had resigned again. And in his letter of resignation, he said he had been so unmercifully bullied and pilloried and pestered with emails and telephone calls and hate mail chiefly from the United States, from scientists in the United States, that he no longer dared to continue, for the sake of his safety and that of his family, to remain as a member of the board of the institution.
The global warmists are a cult.
They're not just a cult. They are a vicious tyranny, and they're trying to impose a narrow and, as we now know, scientifically nonsensical viewpoint on the world. There has now been, according to one of the satellite data sets, no global warming at all for 17 years and 9 months, a completely flat trend. Absolutely no movement at all, 17 years, 9 months. Now, here's the thing, Alex. In how many newspapers have you seen that fact or anything like it recently reported?
Really nowhere. In fact, every summer they point satellites at the northern and southern hemispheres respectively and say they're melting forever, knowing full well they always shrink in the summer. I mean, that's
right. And you see pictures of water pouring off the glaciers, and they say this is because of global warming. No, it's because it's summertime. Get used to it. It's been happening for billions of years. But that is how absurd it's now become. And the news media, the beef I have with them is not so much that most of them are now in this totalitarian class and in this mindset, but that they will not ever print or reveal any fact, however obviously central to the debate and important to it, if in any way that fact casts doubt upon the party line.
Well, sure, there's a new climate gate, for those that don't know, that just broke in the last few weeks. Tell folks about that. We have new examples of them saying we've got to hide the decline. We've got to, not let this data come out. We can't have this paper published.
Oh, they're doing this all the time. I mean, it's a continuous process. It began years ago when the ClimateGate emails came out. It's worth just recalling what happened then, because somebody at the University of East Anglia who had access to its servers started reading the emails between the various scientists around the world that are whipping up this scare. Professor Phil Jones was right at the center of this small group. It's a very small group of scientists who are running this scare. He is one of them, Michael Mann at the University of Virginia, then at Penn State, various others, Kevin Trenberth in Colorado, Ben Santer at Lawrence Livermore. There's only half a dozen of them, really. These were the people, all of them essentially communist in their political outlook, all of them determined to centralize political and scientific power in their own hands as far as possible.
And as you said, Lord Monckton, they relish their collective power, even though individually they can hardly tie their shoelaces, and I'm serious.
Well, that's right. I mean, if you look at the science they produce, it is shoddy in the extreme, full of holes, and of course none of it has come to pass. And when I, for instance, wrote in 2008 in a scientific paper, published in a scientific journal after peer review, that I reckoned the most likely thing was that a doubling of CO2 concentration might cause around 1 Celsius of global warming, and that if you doubled it again, you'd get another 1 Celsius, and after that, you'd run out of things to make CO2 with, and therefore there wasn't a climate problem. There was fury. They, again, this business of them saying we can't have this problem.
Well, they've called for your arrest.
They've done that many times. They've said I should be executed. They haven't just said I should be arrested. They've said I should be executed. Now, this is exactly the kind of language that was used by the French revolutionaries, going back again to the Jacobins. It was used also by, in the days before Hitler came to power, by the Nazi Party. They were calling for the extermination of their opponents. And this is exactly the kind of language which is yet again being used by the totalitarian left.
Oh, now if you support the Tea Party or anything at colleges, the professors say, we're going to kill you, and they're allowed. That was in the news 2 weeks ago. They literally are threatening people. And I noticed the controlled left is ramping themselves up into a bloodlusting lather now and openly saying no one is allowed to challenge them.
This is exactly what happened in pre-Nazi Germany. But as the Nazis were coming to power, they began to command and organize the organs of public opinion. They dominated them just as the left does now. It was the left then. Remember that although there have been attempts to rebrand Hitler as right-wing, he wasn't. It was the National Socialist Workers' Party of Germany. These were leftists. They didn't like the communists because they were rival leftists, not because they were one was right and one was left. They were both leftists. And the Hitlerian movement did exactly this. It began by making increasingly strident demands that its opponents should be rounded up and first imprisoned, then executed, whether with or without trial. They didn't care either way. And people didn't bother to stop them saying this. And that was where the trouble grew. The moment they began to realize that however extreme their rhetoric, however wild their demands that their opponents should be obliterated, they would not be punished. They would not be held to account. Nobody would bat an eyelid.
That's right. That's right. It's not free speech when you say we need to kill our enemies.
Once they realized they could get away with that, they then began implementing what they had been calling for. And the result was 6 million Jews murdered and 100 million people killed in the Second World War. It is extremely dangerous to allow this kind of talk and not to fight back and not to resist it. And the problem I have with today's GOP, with the honourable exception of the Tea Party, is that they are sitting on their large wobbly bottoms and not standing up. And every time this attempt to shut free speech down happens, they are not fighting back. They are not bringing in the Constitution and pointing it at those who are doing this. They are tamely allowing the freedom that built America to be dismantled, not just piece by piece, but now wholesale. The moment you get open calls round the world from the scientific community that anybody who disagrees with them on this subject should be executed, and this is increasingly happening, then, and they are allowed to do this without punishment, then that's when the rot starts. Now, fortunately, in some countries, because of what happened under Hitler, it is now unlawful to call for the execution of those whom you oppose politically. And in Austria, for instance, it is illegal. And in Scotland, where I'm speaking from, it is illegal. And in Austria recently, about this time last year, there was a professor, I won't name him because he eventually backed off. And he published a thing all over the web saying that people who didn't believe that the climate was doomed unless the West was shut down should be executed. He said, no point in trying them, they've just got to be executed. Let's get them out of the way. And of course, there was an outcry, but he went on saying it and trying to justify it until I wrote to him and gave him 24 hours to retract that demand that we should be executed, or I would report him to the Austrian authorities under the hate speech law, and he will be sent to prison for life. And my goodness, you've never had a retraction as quick as the one that came back from him.
Well, that's the thing about the controlled left, is they're such ultra